Oh, good morning, everyone. I'm Ashley Tellis, Senior Associate here at the Endowment. Let me welcome all of you. It's a rather nasty day outside, as best I can tell, so I'm glad you braved the weather to come here. We have a very interesting presentation with us this morning, and certainly a very timely one. It's fascinating to watch the news cycle about Afghanistan in the last month. Early on, there was a spate of reporting that was extremely pessimistic and suggested that the campaign really was lost. We had no hope to retrieve it. And then, as news cycles go, in the last few days, there seems to be a turning around of the story, which now suggests, I guess, partly fed by various reports from the field, that there is in fact progress. And so, if one followed the news reports alone, you would be forgiven if you couldn't make up your mind as to what the story actually was. And so, what I thought we'd do today is actually have two of our guests, Dante Paradiso and Colonel Randy George, give you a slice based on their experience of what has happened in eastern Afghanistan. Both of them have served there. Colonel George was with the 4th Infantry Division, and both were with Task Force Warrior. They've spent time in the field, doing both issues of strategy as well as managing stabilization in all its complexity. And what I've asked them to do this morning is to give us a flavor for what exactly their experiences told them about both the situation in eastern Afghanistan itself, and then hopefully lead up with some thoughts about what this might mean for the future of the campaign. So I'm going to yield the floor to our two guests this morning. I want to take the opportunity to welcome them as well, give them a chance to speak for as long as they want, and then we'll just open the floor to conversation, because that's really what this is about. I mean, the whole effort is to educate ourselves about the complexity of the challenges that we face and hopefully contribute to better public policy making. So without further ado, let me yield the floor to Dante, and then Randy, as you guys see fit, to just take it from here, and I will just be responsible for keeping time and crowd control.
All right. Well, thank you, Ashley, and thanks to the Carnegie Endowment for having us out today, and thanks for everybody who's taken a little bit of time on a pretty nasty day to come and hear a little bit about Afghanistan. Basically, what we generally like to do when we're discussing the problem set is give a little bit of a layout of where we were, the variables that we were facing in the field, and some of the challenges that we saw on the ground, and then we're prepared to talk about some of the solutions that we applied to the situation and where we saw it going as we move forward. And just very quickly again, Colonel George was the brigade commander out there, and I was the senior civilian representative, so his civilian counterpart. And he had about 6,000 troops, and we had about 40 civilians that were integrated across 4 provinces. So again, what we'll do is, he'll talk, I'll talk, and we sort of go back and forth, and we'll probably start with the overall geographic laydown and sort of the ethnic mix and some of the things that we're looking at.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. We are going to, kind of how we briefed this, and I know there's one or two in there who've actually seen this in Afghanistan, had to suffer through some of this. We called this the problem, and what we really did it that way because if you, it's too easy to get focused a lot of times on what's the enemy situation, and a lot of other things, and really what goes into this insurgency is a lot of other things, and you guys have certainly read about many of those subjects. So Dante and I will basically go back and forth. You could probably pick and choose whichever ones, and that's what subjects that you could discuss, whether it's force, laydown, or whatever. So I'll start real quick with geography, just to give you an idea. I don't know who's heard of the Tora Bora Mountains. and famous really for where Osama bin Laden and all that came out. That's along the southern portion that's right here in Nangarhar. We had these 4 provinces. The total population is probably around 4 million people. You can see where we have some of these heavy pieces right here show where the major population centers are. They were primarily in Nangarhar province, which is in the south. Over there where you see at the Dante could point to the far, right over here is where Torkham Gate, and then down that road was toward Peshawar in Pakistan. So we had about 375 kilometers of a border with Pakistan and the federally administrated tribal areas. And so what we'll get to later on is actually having to do complementary operations and actually deal with the pack mill on several issues. As you move up, we have Kunar, very conservative province that's through there, Kunar River Valley. You can see that's where most of the population is up in Kunar. Everybody's probably heard of Korandal. I know Sebastian Junger has done his recent movie that's come out and book. That's basically where you see that sign that says economic. That's the Korandal Valley. It's one of about 5 or 6 valleys that are inside the Pesh River Valley, which is also an offshoot from Kunar. And then as you go further counterclockwise, up around the top, you see Nuristan. You might have seen some of that stuff recently in the news. You give an example of like Barj Matal, you can go, which is a village of about 800. Barj Matal is considered a district capital. There's probably about 2,500 people in the district.
Way up here.
And at the village, which honestly looks, you could take a picture probably out of the 1700s and it would look very much the same as what it looked like several hundred years ago. And you go from about 6,500, I think is where the village is at, 6,500 feet, to about 16,000 feet in about 5 kilometers. So it gives you an idea what you're looking at as far as the terrain. And the terrain is generally like that. You get either down here in the Tora Boras or north. And I bring up geography because it's an important issue when you're getting towards government control and establishing security in a lot of these areas. It definitely plays a large part. And you see the mountains that separated up there in Nuristan. There's basically 3 compartments to that. Those are all 16,000 foot. Those are the peaks that I was talking about that separate into 3 distinct areas. Nuristan is a new province. It wasn't there 10 years ago. So you can see something else. They're a very discrete population. They have their own language up there. And in the past, there's been, with Lashkar-e-Taiba and some of those other groups, there's been a lot of discussions about folks that are up there. But it's really a lack of government reach up in that area, mainly because of geography. And then further down clockwise here, you have Logman province. The Logmanis, and known in Afghanistan as being tricky. It's funny, you get all the stories, but there's a predominant number of people from Logman that are actually working in Kabul. We'll get to a little bit that later, but it's important to understand when you start understanding the human terrain and understanding who's there, who's actually working in Kabul, who's pulling the strings on local politics or having an influence. And that was definitely an area that we saw a lot come from. There's a mountain range that's right here. This is, in the past, Nangarhar whoever was the governor of that was considered an uber governor, and he basically was in charge of the region. Once again, there's mountains right here. This is the road that goes up to Kabul. And there's lots of stories. You look back to the British where they were defeated, trying to pull out. A lot of this happened right here. Historically in those areas.
Yeah, just to underscore what the colonel's saying is that this area in eastern Afghanistan is a really discrete geographical region because you've got 2 river valleys and the central artery that comes from Pakistan all the way to Kabul. So a lot of your logistics, a lot of your economic flow is coming right through that area. The lighter areas are river valleys or lowlands, and everything else is mountains. The other key feature of the geography is really the people that are there. This is a very heavily tribal area. With the exception of Logman, where you do have a lot of different tribal dynamics there, but it's a very politicized society in Logman. They just have a strong history of political parties. With HIG and Jamiat Islami are both there. People switch sides. There's a lot of bargaining. There's a lot of different approaches that people take to their political gains. But down in Nangarhar, for example, you've got 3 major tribes at least. You've got the Khojiani down in this area, the Shinwar in this area, and the Momand in this area. And then everybody is, in one form or another, is in Jalalabad, which is really the economic hub. And then the spokes go up the Kunar River and up into Logman and then out into Kabul. So you really have to understand the dynamics of the tribes, understand what their relationship is to their local government. When you put a situation like this, and you have a situation like this, you come up with, okay, well, what assets are we bringing to bear to address the challenges we face there? And again, with the long border with Pakistan, with many redoubts and places basically that are inaccessible, obviously that having security really relies on a broad network of people, villages, places, and of course state security. To bring to bear on the coalition side, we had about 6,500 troops, and again, under Colonel George's control. This area was unique in some senses because it's an ISAF force, but it was almost all American forces. So we had coordination with the French, who were over here, and of course we dealt with senior NATO officials, particularly from the UK, would come down and work with us. And we had a couple, Latvian ETTs, but in general, it was all American forces. We also had a complementary force of the Afghan National Army there, and they were, around the same size. So you then had about 12,000 troops, and then several thousand police throughout the 4 provinces that were Afghan National Police and Afghan Border Police. And so there were different configurations of folks. And then the other important thing is that we had about 35 to 40 combat outposts and forward operating bases. And those are the places where you're really having your contact with the people. Those are the platforms by which we are reaching, particularly as the U.S. government. And then we also had 4 provincial reconstruction teams that, again, were under the command of the brigade. And those, are much smaller footprints, but they're scattered out between, 6 really ground battalions and, the companies that go with the battalions. So we were working very closely in partnership with the ANA and the ABP in particular, because we had a lot of co-located bases where we were actually, basically sharing the same space on the base. And we also worked with the police on training and things like that, although they were more sort of out and dispersed a little bit. So those were basically the assets we had. And then the only other really important thing is that it was very air-centric for us. In other words, to move around this area, which has the extremes of 10 to 14,000 foot peaks, and then 3,000 foot high valleys all the way down here, we really relied on air logistics to get around, a lot of resupply for some of our forces. So one of the first things that the colonel looked at in particular was realignment, to making sure that we were not in places that were essentially places that you were in simply to resupply yourself, that we would be actually making an impact on the population, that we would be able to take assets and they wouldn't be static positions. And so realign folks so that we were a little bit more in line with the population and better able to partner with our Afghan counterparts on the ground. Go ahead.
Other thing I'll mention just with respect to the forces, it's important to understand is that the ANP were actually local. And what does that mean is they were hired, so they were from the communities. And that really gets back in when you start talking about reconciliation or who you're hiring, and we can give examples about the A&P, but a lot of the A&P were local. The ABP was also local. So what does that mean is they were trained maybe down in Nangarhar, for example, with the border police, but they stayed close to home. The ANA actually were from all different provinces throughout the country, and so that they came up and they were at different bases. But that's different, and what that could create at times was differences with the ANA, ABP, and ANP. So certainly, some of our measures of making sure that when things were getting better are the ANP, which are very local, very trusting of the ANA, and are they all working together? But you had those different dynamics. As part of that, and Dante mentioned the folks, and it's important to also understand how many different organizations that we actually dealt with besides Department of Defense and Department of State, but USDA had folks out, I think, at each one of our battalions that were out there doing things. We had, obviously, USAID had a pretty extensive presence, and then probably about every other three-letter government agency that you can mention, we were actually working with. And the importance of that is just generally, it has to be a very cohesive effort when you're working that, and to make sure that everybody really understands what's going on. And once again, it's back to the problem. Somebody could be doing something that in how they're looking at it looks like it's the right thing to do, but it may cause issues and not necessarily be aligned with everybody's objective or even the overall objective. I'll also mention a little bit on realignment. Some of the places that we did come out of were Keating, and I know some people have probably heard about that, but that was one of the locations. It was up in Nuristan. I think the village outside the gate had about 150 people in it, and then generally outside of that, it was a pretty extensive. I think the whole province or the whole district maybe have had 20 or 2,000 people in it, and very hard to get to. So some of those are the areas that we called it realignment. Could we have stayed in those locations? Sure. But we're absolutely, we're not tied to the terrain just because we have that particular piece. We got to constantly reevaluate where we put where we put our forces. The next is governance. We'll talk. We had 4 governors. Anybody in here heard of Shirzai? Gulaga Shirzai? Pretty interesting character. He was he's the governor down in Nangarhar. He's originally from Kandahar, and really a tribe that's a bit of a competitor with Karzai, or the Popozai tribe that's down in Kandahar. Governor Wahidi, and I'll give you a different example. So, generally what people would think of is very strong, somebody who really has not left the area, who's been in Afghanistan, has a very strong tribe, very strong ties to the people, really understands, the people that are around there. And that sounds strange. You're talking about any Afghan that's leading, but you go to other places like Wahidi, who is up in Kunar, has lived several years in Australia, worked for an NGO, came back generally after 2002, 2003 when he came back. So his family is still there. He's educated, speaks great English, so having a meeting with a guy like that is really easy. But he generally was not as connected to the people. And to the tribes and to the tribal leaders. So competition there with him made his job difficult. The governor up in Nuristan, educated in Saudi Arabia, Salafist, and he and Catherine over there could tell you quite a bit more about him. A younger fellow was generally, like all of these, appointed from the center. And did not go to Nuristan. He's originally from Barj Matal, didn't have a lot of interest in going to Nuristan because life up there is pretty tough. And like I said, you're looking at there's no running water, there's very little electricity. So he lived basically in Kabul or Jalalabad, and that really tells you he's disconnected from the people. And that was a big problem that we had with him. We went through a couple of changes on the governor of Logman. And we got a younger governor in a couple months before we left, very well educated. Had been the director for education, I think, down in Nangarhar. Had been there. I think he went to school and even had a graduate degree in Pakistan. So educated, very well spoken. But he was once again up to in Logman. There's a very strong tribe called the Logmani. He was not part of it, and so there was definitely challenges for him in there is navigating that. 53 districts make up that whole area. So you've got 4 governors, and then there's 53 districts, and all of those district sub-governors were appointed from the center. So they basically are decided and then appointed out there, and we'll probably get to this again, but these are very consensus-driven people. They get together shuras and jirgas and those kinds of things, and so there's a little bit of that. And in some areas, those district sub-governors worked, and then in many others, they didn't. Dante mentioned the 3 big things. Jalalabad, I think, is over 1 million people. I mean, it's a large, sprawling city, cell phones everywhere. I mean, just completely different than what you would find if you go just a couple hours north. The infrastructure has changed this area, where it used to take from Asadabad, where you see up here, to get down to Jalalabad, was like a 2-day trip because the roads were so terrible. Now you're looking at about 3 hours, less than the Afghans. I don't know where they got their driving, maybe from, I've been to Italy, the Italians, but they can make a 2-lane road, a 4-lane road really quick. So traffic moves pretty good. But that has changed, economically, and reach and everything has changed that area, which definitely affects governance.
Just to add, on the overall structure of the government that we were looking at, in addition to the governors and the district governors, who are, understandably a large focus, you had line ministries. It's a unitary state, which means that you have, your education department appoints education department representatives down at the provincial level and down all the way to the district level. So, part of our challenge in looking at governance all the way through was, first of all, helping enable the provincial government to, allocate resources and connect itself better to the people. And you also had parliamentarians that came from this area and then are, back in Kabul a lot of the time. But it's enabling the capacity of, key ministries to deliver services to the people. And, that was sort of the expectation that comes in. And again, when you're dealing with 50 areas, some of those are, insecure, and some of those areas are highly insecure. And in those cases, people had trouble getting to work. They had trouble sustaining themselves. And then there was the basic issue of the budget, and sort of whether people had enough of a budget to, one, get out and do their jobs. In general, salaries seemed to be paid, but whether people had the additional resources, and it was something that we were constantly talking about. It's hard to get somebody off of corruption, or to tell them, hey, go out and work with your folks, if they can't even reach their constituents because they can't afford cab fare, or their salaries are too low. So certainly in the center, in Kabul, people were working very hard on incentivizing those jobs and those positions. They were doing civil service training in Kabul to try to get a higher quality of candidate. But at the same time, as the colonel mentioned, the real key is how that is advertised and how that's explained to, and how local folks are brought into the process. We often looked at it as, if you're on a local PTA, do you want somebody from Washington coming in and saying, okay, well, this is where, this is how we're going to run, the school district in this area and in that. And, a lot of folks need to find a way to take ownership and feel better connected to their government. So a lot of what we were looking at was really finding the best way to connect the informal structures with the formal structures. And, it's particularly important because, in Afghanistan at this point in time, district governance is the lowest level of governance. So you've got, in Khojiani district, for example, there's 41 villages, and there's one district center where the line ministry representatives are, and the district governor are off and on, depending on the security situation. But that means that everybody out in the villages really has still their own original, organizing principles. And, village elections are on the books, for a future date. But that's something that, is still a challenge in terms of making sure that all of these different indigenous community organizations feel that they are able to participate and that this government is representative of them. And so, one of our outreach efforts was really to make sure that they understood, where the government was coming from and help the government itself get out and make sure that they were planning, connecting, and allocating resources appropriately for the folks. I want to talk a little bit about the enemy situation. It is a war. We didn't really see this through a development lens. Obviously, there are significant development challenges after 30 years of war. And I will say that, as the Colonel mentioned, a great deal has been done. The economy has received billions of dollars that have really actually inflated a lot of costs out in local areas. I mean, you can go up to some of the most remote places that you've ever been, and people are like, well, okay, it costs more than $10 an hour for people to work, and you say, well, wait a second, that's higher than our minimum wage. So how did that happen? Because a lot of that comes from how we allocate our contract money. Mm-hmm. So we were very cognizant of that. But again, there was significant insurgent pressure throughout the area. But what we found was interesting is we were not in a heavy Taliban area. The Quetta Shura and the Peshawar Shura and Taliban writ large was not the most influential thing. You had a diversity of enemies of the state or folks that were in conflict with the state. It was, HIG, HIC, LET, a whole bunch of other organizations that were out there. And then again, you had the disconnect. So you had tribal groupings that were ambivalent at best toward their relationship with the state. And, so again, if you go to Nangarhar, you had, some Taliban presence down here, but at the same time, you also have criminal networks that are running, some poppy cultivation, although very little, because Governor Shirzai was fairly effective early on in efforts to tamp down on that. However, you certainly had labs and processing and money laundering. And so those networks would, they could operate out in the fringes, and then they can come into Jalalabad and take advantage of the network of services and the anonymity of a large center. Down in Khojiani, it's the same thing. There were folks that were moving back and forth across the border. Some of those are ideologically affiliated with the Taliban. But throughout this area, a lot of these folks are, HIG and other groups that were just, not aligned with the state. And, the question is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth, but when you talk, reconciliation or reintegration writ large with the Taliban, how does it affect all these other groups on the ground, and how does it affect the communities that may or may not see themselves as aligned with the Taliban? And what we found also is that after 8 or 9 years in this area, there was certainly some frustration with the coalition, but we also found a great number of people willing to work with us, a great number of people who were looking to maintain and strengthen the relationship. And when we did the outreach, we definitely found responsiveness in villages and communities throughout, even in villages and communities where they may have in the past been in conflict with us for one reason or another. And part of the key to understanding is understanding the local dynamics, because what we found is in some valleys and villages, it was our presence that had caused tensions where we may have aligned ourselves with one cousin in a village, only to find that we were actually engaging ourselves in a local conflict. And the situation that we want to be in is really withdrawing from being the active focal point for the conflict to more in the mediation role and supporting the Afghan efforts to come forward. So that's just a little bit about the enemy situation. The only other thing is that there was a lot of smuggling that was going on. particularly timber coming down from Nuristan here, and gemstones. But part of the reason that the smuggling was there is that folks had, traditionally, probably up until the late 70s, early 80s, managed their own resources locally. So now, the central government basically put a ban on timber movement, and for reasons of trying to protect the resource and waiting until the situation is more stable. But of course, that created some conflict with a lot of local stakeholders that had equities in the movement and management of timber across the border. So.
Example of the timber and the gems, for example, the gems, and there's been articles about, hey, listen, there's this much, a significant amount of money up in Nuristan, and some of those in Kunar. But if the government comes out and says we're going to tax everything at 45%, pretty significant on gems, and so people will generally just find a way around it. So they end up paying a 15% tax or a 20% tax. And unfortunately, what that does is a lot of times supports criminal networks that are out there. And so that's really the challenge with imposing some of the stuff that's from the state, from the center. It's also important to remember what Dante was talking about, all these different groups. So you have the HIG, is largely also seen as a political party. And you don't think about that a lot, but a lot of these political parties, which also then go over into Pakistan, you also have people that are part of that political party that are in the ANA or the ABP. So you really have to understand that aspect of it as well, to understand who the people are that you're dealing with. One of our primary interlocutors with the HIG was actually in the ABP and knew a lot of folks, and he was very well thought of in the area. Probably about 75% of the people in these 4 provinces generally considered themselves as aligned with interest with the HIG. And so that goes to tell you that if you're getting at reconciliation or those kind of discussions, that you're talking to a different group of people. And there were other pockets as well. So you just have to understand the differences on that. It's also important to note that you may have a family out there with a foot in several different camps hedging their bets, and that was very common. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about some of the problems. I think we've gotten to some of them. We used to when people would come and ask us about specifically, what are our challenges, and we try to look at it through the lens of the people. We would go ask them what the problems were. What was down 3 or 4 on the list was the bad guys. The first thing that they would mention was, inefficient, ineffective local governance. That was a challenge for them. And then closely related to that was often was corruption. Dante mentioned there's 2 different types of corruptions. You got a guy who's responsible for going out and doing the land deeds and settling land disputes, and there's a significant amount of it. I think it's a problem around the world. It certainly was the same type of issues in Iraq, but he's going out, he gets paid a salary, but he gets paid nothing. There's no budget for him to actually go out. So when somebody would say, hey, we want you to come out and settle our land dispute, he'd say, you have to pay my travel out there. So someone would say, okay, he's corrupt because, surely the government gets paid to do these kinds of things. He didn't, and it was about explaining for that. So operating budgets was definitely a challenge. You also had issues with the police that were out there, and we can give stories about how people would, if they go out and they ask a policeman for help, and he says it's going to cost them a certain amount of money, which they don't have, then they're going to turn to somebody looking for justice, and so that's also certainly a challenge. What we found was our biggest challenge was the infusion of our own money. And you look at how much money that we're actually putting in over there. One of the things that we instituted shortly after arriving was we had the Commander's Emergency Response Program, or those CERP funds. And what we did was align them, give them each a budget. Now, we went out, and the first couple of times we had 400 or 500 elders in the middle of Kunar, and we said, hey, listen, we're going to give you, every district is going to get $200,000 or $250,000, depending on the population. You're going to get a budget. Now, we still controlled that money because it was CERT funds. I mean, I had to sign off on all of that stuff in order for us to actually pay it out. But what we found is by doing this, by doing a budget, we'd had schools that we were paying close to that amount for, is people started coming out of the woodwork and saying, okay, it doesn't cost that much money to do these things. Now, when it was very transparent, and that was one of our goals of doing a budget, is everybody got to see how much money they had. And what does that mean? Everybody took an interest in it, in exactly how much money we were spending. So we started to see them focusing on very small projects that benefited a lot, very similar to what the dynamics that we would find with stuff. Hey, you had to solve all the constituents want a little bit, so they may not want the big thing anymore. They may need a retaining wall that benefits the entire village from being flooded out. They don't want a brand new school that costs a whole bunch of money. What they want is to build up, and they'll contribute some of the labor. They're just going to buy the materials and they're going to fix their own school. So they would find that they would make that $200,000, stretch a little bit more. The other thing that it benefited us is rather than giving the top 10 list, which I think is too often, hey, you go out to somebody and you say, hey, what do you want? Those kind of point-to-point transactions depends on who you talk to. So I go to you and ask you for a project, you give me something and it benefits just your tribe, and it is a problem with the tribe that's next door. So a lot of these point-to-point things, very opaque reconstruction methods, really cause a lot of issues by how we're doing that. So we use that to help clean that up. It also helped us with actually establishing government. I mean, that's what governments do. They allocate resources. And then if they didn't have a resource to give, if we're just out there more or less as a shadow government saying, hey, what is it? And we'll help you do it. But this put the ball into their court. We would often joke that some of the politicians are in their best possible situation. If it gets delivered, everybody says, yeah, you did it. You did a great job. And we would herald that on the radio and everything else. If a project wasn't done or it was dubbed substandard, it was our fault. So what this did was basically put the ball in their court and make them actually be responsible to their people. I will tell you that there's a lot of them that didn't like it when it came out, because it did. Now all of a sudden they were responsible for that money. They were responsible to their people. And we actually had several tribal elders in one location that came at a very large meeting and said, our district sub-governor's corrupt, he needs to go. And so it started a lot of grassroots with that. So third on the list was, so I mentioned governance and corruption, and then probably third or fourth, depending on what it was. It may be health or something else. A lot of times was the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or whatever the element that they were specifically talking about. You have to remember this, all these different valleys. I mentioned the Pesh River Valley, which is an offshoot from Kunar, and there's 5 or 6 other valleys that are off of that. There's several different valleys, and all the problems were slightly different as you went up into each one of them, which meant the solutions are going to be also a little bit different in every valley. But a lot of the problems security-wise with folks could have been, we looked at methods of dealing with those other than, and we certainly, kinetic operations are something that you have to do. I've seen a lot of that in the news. And the right people that are basically irreconcilable, recalcitrant, that the community would even say, hey, that person, and I could list names of ones where they would say, hey, these people have to go. And we definitely need to continue to focus on those folks.
Just to add on just a little bit more about some of the budgeting process, because obviously questions come up and say, okay, well, why is that not the Afghan government, and how are they not doing it? There were a couple challenges. One is that at the top level, folks were working. We had a Treasury advisor in, and folks were working with the ministries in Kabul to make sure that they can allocate the resources at the national level and then down to the provincial level. But once you got down to the district level, it became a lot harder, as I said, to see funding moving or understand how they accessed funds, through the districts. what we were doing was basically taking a look. We had, over time, with our provincial reconstruction teams and others, basically been a shadow government. So, it again had that dependency being enabled, which was, okay, if you guys can't, you need something, we're here to push out resources, help you build the country. So whatever it is you need, we're going to try to be responsive because that's how we're building up, helping you build your society. And what we were trying to do is shift the emphasis. Okay, what are you going to do? How are you going to identify the problem set? And how are you going to, govern effectively and deliver those resources? Now, at the local level, essentially they didn't have local revenue generation. They didn't have local taxing authority in most cases outside of municipalities. So, that's something that they're going to have to look at over time because if you're just waiting for the center to push money down, you may not have the resources necessary to do the day-to-day, delivery of services. So again, ours is a, transitional initiative to really move folks until they have a better understanding of how to do budgets and things like that, which they hadn't done before because they could just show up at a PRT and say, here are the 10 projects I'd like, and we'd go out and build it. The other thing is we significantly reduced the number and size of projects, really the size of projects. We had millions of dollars of projects. And again, there was some significant outcomes. Building the roads had, in a globalized society next to a place like Pakistan, China is a neighbor, did allow goods and services to flow quicker, faster, and then with the additional infusion of money just from all the activity, you certainly have, economic activity that you just didn't have. We also built 7 bridges across the Kunar River. And those bridges, really facilitated, for the first time, groups, just having economic transactions right across the river. So that was actually a way that we had done that in the past. But now it's time to start to transition to make sure that those systems are sustainable organically or indigenously. So we were looking at that. And what we found is that we also went with smaller projects, things that were community identified and that the communities themselves would take ownership of. So we had a lot more projects, but they were small. They were discrete time frames. One of the things we dealt with when we came in was legacy projects, something that had been started by a brigade or a PRT or a battalion 2 or 3 years ago, and then people lose track of the contracting. And what we were doing is tamping down on that and saying, okay, we're going to do things that we can complete, that we can monitor. And so we had a lot more projects. But again, the community input and the community buy-in was important. And the other thing is that we found, again, really a top source of corruption was the control of our contracting funds. So, if we had a single contractor that we were going to over and over and over, a community would see if that contractor was building a big house. And they would often sell the contracts in pieces so that they could take some of the profit. And so what we were doing is by involving more of the community, involving more of the line ministries, and then being transparent by broadcasting all this on radios, television, and other materials that we put out. Teach Taylor was one of our PAOs out there, and he had the effort that was to broadcast what we were doing. That transparency really changed dynamics on the ground.
One other thing I'll mention is with growth of the ANSF and how what we try to do to link that to also to reintegration, basically political accommodation. I use an array as an example. It's a district that's way up north here. We basically had a district up here. We were trying to get kind of a non-contiguous presence because we had limited resources in between there. You had Gujars, and you could list several different tribal tribes up there that wouldn't necessarily mean anything to the group right now. But if all of your police are from one particular tribe, and the district sub-governor, that's an issue, and it causes problem. One is as much as if people have to feed their families, so it also gets to a part of that with the job allocation. One example of actually expanding the police department up there that worked very well for us was just hiring 50 people from getting everybody together and hiring 50 people from making sure it was an equal distribution. The police were going to grow anyway, but it's very important that you're picking the right people, especially if they're police, border police, or national police, because they're going to be from that area. So if they're going to secure that area, they're going to have to all work that area. And it's really local political accommodation that has to happen between all those tribes. So those things have to happen almost in every district. The complicating factors is that you get, it's nice when everything fits in the nice lines, and everybody in this district is this tribe and that, but it doesn't work that way. And a lot of these problems spill over, just like the Momon tribe, which is down in here. They're basically, the Momon tribe go like this, and all the way into Pakistan. So you have to understand who the people are on both sides of that, and making sure you're gathering people. Those lines that we draw in there don't change how people see things day in and day out. So growth of ANSF, that was one of the big things that we try to look at, was making sure that we're hiring, obviously, the right people. We trained those policemen at local location. We made them show up every day at 7 o'clock in the morning. We made them do PT. They actually ran around the whole fob. They stayed, they did not miss a day of training, and they were there for 21 straight days, except for on Fridays. But they came every day. They did not miss. They wanted to be part of the police force. But all the tribal leaders had selected those people to be a part of that, and that was crucial for them to succeed.
I think, we probably get to questions shortly, so I'll just, just give a couple concluding thoughts, and also the Colonel will too, and then we can take your questions. So, I think one of the things about bringing a lot of different folks into the security is just really making sure that, again, it's a war. Part of our whole effort, there are folks that are not going to be reconciled, and there are folks that are going to get taken off the battlefield. And the important thing is synchronizing the narrative with our Afghan counterparts, because there are local policemen and there are local, Afghans in the military that are trying their hardest to actually get out there and work for their country and build their country up. And, one of the challenges is making sure that when there is success on the ground, when a unit, performs well, when they go into a community and they work with that community, that their success is messaged, that they are seen as, having, being supported from Kabul, from their provincial government, and that they are not blamed for things that go wrong in their efforts to reach out to community, because again, they're putting their lives on the line for their country. And as our counterparts, we all have to work together to synchronize the message. The second thing is that, diplomacy is relations over time. We do have heavy troop relations. We do have a lot of different civilians coming in and out, different levels of experience. It's really important to establish those relations with various groups and then to follow up on them. We had a very good handover with the 1101. Which was the follow-on brigade. And then, the civilians also actually make a difference in that, because we have people that would extend, the tours of duty are very different. So there's some institutional knowledge that can be built in, but it is important, the Afghans certainly, those who are less favorable to us understand our battle rhythm. They understand when we're rotating, and they know sort of where our leverage points are in terms of, okay, now I got to ask this person for new projects because I can regain control of the thing. So passing on knowledge and maintaining those relationships over time is very important. And then the final point is that there's a lot of talk about counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, and I would just underscore that regardless of what paradigm you're operating under and how large your footprint is, some of the basic things that you're going to do still have to be there. You really still have to reach the people. You still have to work, and we do this all over the world, to ensure that our allies are supported in a way that their government is responsive to the people, and that the people feel that they have a stake in their government. And that's the way over time we can build credible alliances that will ultimately protect our interests, because at the end of the day, this comes down to U.S. national interests It comes down to, how is our security being protected? So as all of this comes together, and as these governance institutions strengthen, those are the partners that you'll rely on for interdiction and security over time.
Any questions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so very much. That was extremely useful because it gives you a sort of a micro slice beyond the 80,000 feet perspectives that generally dominate the news cycle. I want to ask the first question to kind of push you, not to extrapolate for all of Afghanistan, but there are national objectives that the president has tasked as part of this campaign. And those national objectives are degrading the opposition, increasing security, and helping increase the legitimacy of the government of Afghanistan. Those are broadly the campaign objectives that the United States is pursuing. If we take those as reference points in the area of responsibility that both of you worked in, how do you think we've been doing? How do you think we've done? So that's the first question. The second is, how have we done with respect to endurance? That is, once you guys leave the area, whatever gains you have achieved, are those likely to survive? Because that's going to be an important question as one thinks about the future. And the third is, how are we doing with respect to dependence and autonomy? That is, again, once you go, can we feel comfortable that whatever gains you've made will, in a sense, persist because the Afghans have now taken responsibility and made, your achievements their own? Or are we likely to, in a sense, go back into a cycle where whoever your successors are have to go back to rebuilding this? So if you could say something to those three questions, and then I'll open it to the House.
I'll just speak in broad terms and talk about, you can see the progress on the ground for Afghans economically. I was in Medarlam in July, which is over here in Lagman, and I was actually asking shopkeepers because there was a shop with, Chinese generators that they were bringing in that they were fixing. So it was a repair shop. Despite the timber ban, there was, furniture making stores. There were certainly a lot of fruits and vegetables in the markets. In a conflict situation, there's many variables about which you can be pessimistic. I think that the question is going to come down to the reconciliation, reintegration process on the ground among Afghans, because what you are seeing is a lot more people who have a stake in the success of the state. And again, we were in a heavily contested Pashto area, largely Pashto area, and I can't. Having not served in the rest of Afghanistan, there are many different variables, but what you did see is a lot of local business owners, a lot of community leaders that had more success, more at stake in not managing the conflict than in managing the conflict. So while there is still war profiteering, while there are networks that profit from moving weapons, moving drugs, ensuring that the conflict continues, I think that there's clearly evidence on the ground that they've made significant progress economically in this area that we were operating. And if you were going to speak to hopeful signs, I think that would be the kind of things that you would look at. And the other thing is that they have run several rounds of elections. Again, we can talk about how difficult it is to hold those elections and the challenges of holding those elections, but the elections have been held. And the idea of a government that is broadly representative is something that is actually harder for people to let go of than it is to impose something else. So I think if you were looking at what the insurgents are offering there, what you're going to find is that it's a model where people that have not really been necessarily in and of the communities coming in saying, well, okay, it's our way, versus a model that's saying, okay, you have a stake in which way this is going. And so I think in that respect, that model is out there. It is in people's minds, and I think that's why a lot of folks were willing to engage with us despite years of war. And the other thing is, I think, there is some fatigue out there, certainly in some communities that we were with. They understood what they were asking for was, hey, we want to be part of something. We don't constantly want to be cut off. So that's kind of how we saw it.
I just mentioned one thing that I think you could basically extrapolate from us and maybe larger is what we found very successful is being transparent. I mean, is actually you can't have a corrupt district sub-governor put him on the radio and say that you support him, and there's just things like that you can't do. Our big thing was, we're not smart enough to, run around trying to worry about what the messages are we're putting out. We're just got to be very honest about what we're doing, honest about the mistakes that we're making, and then moving forward with that. So transparency was, and that was we had the media with us an extensive amount as well, and being very open to them. That transparency really helped us with local Afghans, because they either think they really don't believe we're that naive to be doing some of the things that we're doing. They oftentimes see us, and it's part of as co-conspirators in some of the things that happen, and it's important that you get all that open, and that was generally my opinion of how they looked at it. So I think that's critical. I think the last year has been basically a transition. I mean, we've been building up with a lot of assets. We had with the military surge, with the civilian surge, with a lot of those things that are required. And I think that you're seeing a lot of what's happening now on the ground because of that. The unit that came in behind us maintained a lot of the same. We were in contact with them the whole year prior to them coming over. A lot of communication. They were looking at our stuff. So a lot of the systems in place, they would adapt. But it's certainly a dynamic situation, and they have to change with it as well.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm going to open it to the floor. So anyone, Jill. Jill, microphone.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your presentation. I have just a question, because when Ashley was asking the question about the progress or non-progress in this area, I was not totally satisfied with the answer, because the answer was a lot about inputs, outputs, but not much about the outcomes. And what is striking in this place is that the last 2 years, the Taliban have made a lot of progress. Mm-hmm. So very concretely, all the Horiani district, all the south to Jagdalek and Sarubi, there are much more Taliban than before. Of course, Nuristan Kunar is becoming totally a place where you cannot go, basically. And when you're speaking with people who are from Jalalabad, they say the Taliban are much closer than before. So Gulhara Shirzai has lost a lot of power, a lot of influence. So we are in a situation where clearly things are much worse than even 4 or 5 months ago. And to be very clear, the road from Jalalabad to Kabul is no more safe the way it was. It was, I mean, except the driving, that's something else. But except the driving, the road was mostly safe. It's no more exactly the case, and you have more and more attacks, as you know, just south of Jalalabad when you're going to Kabul. So the answer to Ashley's question is that no, the situation, maybe you're better on the input or output, but the outcomes are terrible, absolutely terrible.
Well, again, if you look at where they were, in 2001, and you look at the number of businesses, and you look at what's going on, you will see, again, some positive things. Was this the most intense fighting season, as far as I know? It was a very, very intense fighting season this summer. That's to be expected. You're dealing with sub-state actors. It is very, very easy to be disruptive as a sub-state actor. You have asymmetrical warfare, so people can plant a roadside bomb, they can melt away. I will tell you that, I've served in other war-torn places. I was in Liberia for the climax of the Civil War there. Every single day I heard gunfire, mortar, etc. That's not the environment that we were operating in Afghanistan. What we had is a very lethal enemy, but it was an enemy that also understood that they needed to reach the people, that their legitimacy is derived from that too. So there's a competition there. The other thing is that I cannot speak to, August, September. and I can't speak to the elections, although they did happen in the area. And the ANSF had much greater input and control into that. But what you can talk to is the reason you have so many land disputes is because so many people are returning to Afghanistan. There were hundreds of thousands of people that have come back from refugee camps in Pakistan. Now, you can draw various conclusions from that data, but people felt that there were certain areas that they wanted to return to and be part of a process. So again, as I mentioned before, it is always easy to find negative variables in a war and to be cynical. Change takes place over time, and it's going to, at the end of the day, the question is whether, the local people are going to want to participate in something that, has a certain ideological bent, or whether they, want to be part of a broader effort that has clear economic benefits to them. And I think that, those economic benefits are there. And when you also talk about you can go or you can't go, there is a difference for expatriates and local Afghans. And yes, local Afghans are definitely under threat, but it's that same threat that people stand up and eventually they do respond. Communities do get together. There is one example in particular in the South, not our area, but I heard about it on my way out, where people said, all right, enough. We see what is being offered on the other side. So, again, that's sort of where I come out on it.
I honestly believe that at the local level, what's got to start happening more is, and we did a list of just looking at who the power brokers and who the people respected, and too many of those people are really outside the government that are in a lot of these areas. And Kunar, as an example, Haji John Dodd, a former Muj guy, is very influential in 3 or 4 provinces. He's not connected to the government. So I think that very locally, that those are the kinds of things. I mean, to me, it's very local governance piece that is having, that will have the biggest impact, and pulling those in. And some of that's devolving some of that power as far as who gets assigned, to some of these areas that I think will make an impact. And I don't know exactly where we're at in that. I think people recognize that that's an issue in Kunar and a lot of these places, and pulling some of these folks in. So I definitely think that is something that needs to start happening to pull some folks in.
Thank you. I'd like to cast my question in the context of a phrase that was just used, namely that change takes place over time. But as I look back over everything that's happened since 2001, the fundamentals in Afghanistan have really not changed. It's only questionably a nation. Its government is riddled with corruption. It holds its power only as a result of fraudulent elections. We're fighting an intractable adversary that has outlasted the British and the Russians. And now we find out that the Karzai government is engaged with the Iranians. I don't know that the U.S. has a more despised adversary in the world than Iran. Maybe there is, but. So my question is, and I've been going to programs on Afghanistan now for the last several months to try to learn what the heck we're doing there and what we get out of this. Keeping the Karzai government in power? What do we get out of this strategically? That's my question.
Counsel? No. Yeah. Yeah, look, the bottom line is we were attacked from, sub-state actors that were operating in a essentially lawless environment, literally in, the area that we were serving. So the idea is to deny space for that. And, what we're working toward is creating security conditions on the ground where there's enough buy-in from the local population to work with us and have a government that is responsive enough to their needs that they feel that they can participate and that we can ask and rely on those folks to help protect our national security interests, which is, again, ensuring that the sub-state actors can't use that as a base to attack us moving forward. So that's the interest that's at stake there. And again, working directly with people and building that relationship over time is how you get at trying to protect that interest, trying to ensure that there are allies on the ground. And we can talk again about a lot of the constraints in Kabul. We can talk about constraints on the ground, but it doesn't answer the question to talk about the challenges as to how we ensure that the sub-state actors can't use that as a base or move forward. So that's how I see it. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, it's I know it sounds trite to say, I don't establish policy as far as what's going on at that level. I do think that that we basically have to attack the problem from both ends. And certainly some of the things that you're talking about, that happen that you see happen at the strategic level, we're faced with the same types of problems at the provincial level and the local level, and it's really about exerting our influence and letting everybody know exactly what our interests are and being very transparent about it. We had to have conversations in the open to say, hey, this is the type of behavior that we will not, locally, this is what we won't put up with this, and we can't put up with it. But I certainly don't know the situation, and I have my own opinion on it, but I certainly wouldn't want to speak to the whole strategic picture. I'm not sitting in those meetings, so.
It's an important question. I mean, there's no doubt that policymakers at the national level have to answer that question. And there's a gentleman who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania who has to essentially answer the electorate that question. I think what can be done most profitably in a discussion like this is to get a sense for whether what is happening on the ground is advancing the stated objectives of the country or not. It's not that I'm reluctant to entertain the question. It's simply that I don't think in this group right here we can answer the grand strategic question of whether we ought to be supporting Karzai because he happens to be collecting bags of money from the Iranians. Interesting and problematic though that may be. I think the question here is there in the telling enough evidence that somehow there is reason for hope, or in the telling, it's not effective enough and is not meeting the aims of policy. I think that's the best one can get when one looks at these empirical questions. And the reason I think it's important to look at these issues at the empirical level is otherwise we end up discussing the grand strategic questions in the abstract. And I think what a discussion like this can fruitfully do is give us a flavor for what is actually happening on the ground so that we can reach those conclusions ourselves. Yes, sir.
Colonel George, you really haven't talked about the military side of the equation. I get the impression from your talk that during your tenure there wasn't much of a Taliban footprint. But could you talk more about the tactics you employed, the military side of the equation, the tactics you employed, how you went after them, how you then dovetailed these with the civilian side of the operations that you were talking about?
Up in our area, it was a basic light infantry fight because of the terrain in a lot of the area. We used artillery extensively, dropped CAS or used aircraft. So we basically used everything at our disposal, and it probably happened on almost a daily basis somewhere in the 4 provinces that we were located. And it's a very porous border that's through there, so a lot of that was dealing with that going back and forth. So a lot of it was interconnected, and you can't be everywhere. So a lot of it was working with combining with the ANA and the ANSF to go after where we thought they were located. But there was military operations that were going on a daily basis that were happening over there.
How frequent was your contact?
I mean, it depended on which area you're talking about. Like you're mentioning Kunar, significant. I would say that we had significant contact in Kunar. And the problem is when you look at significant activities, what you'll look at sometimes is you may somebody fires 3 rounds at you, and that gets recorded as a as an action that happened. So sometimes those numbers go up. Generally, like I said, in Kunar, that was our highest location, and then some areas up in Nuristan. There were certainly some areas where going there. We had some of these was providing an irritant, and that's why I mentioned about coming out of some of those locations. And we actually had people come down to us and start wanting to work towards us. But yeah, we conducted military operations. I could probably talk to you for hours about military operations that we conducted up there, and it's all part of it. It's just like I mentioned with you see a lot about CT. We're trying to kill our way. I mean, it's all of it. It's kind of a whole of government approach for this. It's required, and we did that as part of that. We tried, like I said, we tried to be very transparent about too, is who it was that we were actually going after. So Karya Zia Rahman was a prominent bad guy, and we were very open about the guys that we were going after. And we wanted everybody to know, hey, listen, we're not hiding anything. This is who we see as upsetting the balance here, and we're going after him.
Simon.
Thanks, Ashley. Simon Shercliffe from the British Embassy here in Washington, working on Afghanistan-Pakistan policy. First of all, thank you very much, and can I congratulate you on presenting a very good, solid Civ Mill impression of the way in which you were conducting your business in Afghanistan. It's not always the case, frankly, from someone that sees it from the inside as the outside, and the outside as well. But that's a really good impression. My question is really on a perception issue. So I'd like to ask your views of the perception of the people in which you came into contact over the course of your year, but through the prism of the question of sustainability, rather than attack from the very top this business of whether or not we're going to achieve our national security objectives of keeping ourselves safe and avoiding another 9/11, although that is the context. It's really quite clearly what we need to do, all of us, is to reach a stage of sustainability so that our interaction with Afghanistan at the strategic level, political level, local level, civil, military, training, whatever it may be, is sustainable over the long term. And as you were saying, Dante, this is a long-term game. Diplomacy is all about engagement over time. And so quite clearly where we need to get to, where the President has signalled that we need to get to, it's the same with our own Prime Minister and many others, is a sustainable long-term relationship situation, which will be multifaceted. Some of it will be military training teams and so on. Some of it will be diplomatic, political. Lots of it will be aid. Now, in order to get to that stage, we need to continually satisfy ourselves that we're minimising the risk level for another 9/11. To be simplistic about it. So that requires a convergence of interests, our interest, avoiding that, and the interest, coming onto this perception piece, of the people who actually live out there is very much as you set out, to try and get their own lives onto a sustainable footing, which involves, setting up businesses, interacting with each other peacefully rather than fighting. That convergence of interest, then, is absolutely critical to this whole piece. In the course of the year that you were out there, did you sense that there was a perception from the Afghan side of that convergence of interest? In other words, were they willing to buy into this long-term vision of a relationship that we have? And what do you think is their sort of acceptable level of investment from us in terms of boots on the ground and money and things like that?
I was going to say, I think there is a convergence of interests. And I mean, certainly in our area, most people did not have an interest in the Taliban or the HIG or somebody else, but they sought justice. They were disappointed by what they were dealing with locally, with corruption and some of those things. So, I mean, I think that our interests lie together. It's just how we go about producing that. And I do think that what's critical is how that plays out at the local. It's a very decentralized state. That's got to happen at the local level, that we got to build those relationships. And so I think that the flexibility, and I'm talking even from the Afghan government, that they've got to devolve some of that power to have the flexible, the friends that you have in some of these locations are different than what you're dealing with in other, down in the South or other places. And they really control this area. So having those right people that are there, that are our friends, that have the same interest, that are about establishing governance that it at least supports the people and continues to move that forward, I think is critical.
I think we saw concrete examples where when we reached out to folks and when we signaled that we on the U.S. side, because there is some perception out there that this is not always an Afghan war, but also our war, as opposed to the Afghans are fighting for their state. That perception can be mitigated when we reached out and we signaled, okay, we're willing to talk to anybody on the ground. We'll talk to insurgents from different factions, and we want to know who you are, and we want to understand what your equities are. When we did that, again, with certain very, very hardcore Al-Qaeda aligned folks who had an equity in fighting us, many other folks were willing to approach us. They were willing to come in and at least talk to us, at least try to figure out what it is. So, unless you are in constant dialogue, you can't arrange the circumstances whereby you understand, okay, are our interests converging or not? And so reintegration initiatives that were local did start to bear some fruit. I think the challenge is, again, fitting it into where Kabul sees itself going and where the national government sees itself going. But certainly, again, you can look at it and say, well, Hig elements might be willing to talk with you because they think they're losing too much ground to the Taliban. I mean, that's a fair estimation, but unless you're sitting in the room with them and understand what the dynamics are, it's really hard to speculate as to why they are approaching you now. But they certainly did approach us when we sent out signals. That was true in Kunar. That was true in Logman. In those cases, again, our red line is your affiliation, association with Al-Qaeda or transnational terrorism, leaving the area to attack our interests elsewhere. And, again, just seeing from the press and from a very, very distant area, there's always trouble with, or there's always interesting dynamics with folks like Hekmatyar. But at the same time, on the local ground, there are people within his organization or affiliated with him that are on a daily basis reading, okay, well, where do my equities lie? And those conversations, those things, people were willing to have with us, despite the fact that we'd been in conflict with them. I mean, we had people that had been in Guantanamo that went back out and they started up their affiliations, and at the same time, they wanted to keep the relationship with us. They wanted to understand, how we saw things. And their number one question is, are you going to target us? Because I can't come in and talk to you if you guys are targeting us. And they were more than willing, in many cases, to talk to their Afghan counterparts. So again, there's evidence that, a certain number of people in this particular area were willing to at least understand where we were coming from and see our perspective. So,
the challenge was, you take a guy like we had Mullah Sadiq, who was he was up here in eastern Nuristan and in this area, and he was Hig. He was respected throughout that whole area. I mean, he was the guy that everybody kind of looked to, educated, well-spoken. So we go and we want to start talking to him, and he'd been targeted, was very high on the list. And you find out from all the local people up there is that, hey, he's the guy, we actually care about him. He's part of our community. He's been here for a long time. And the reason that you go back to the story is, why was he targeted? Well, he was targeted because the district sub-governor didn't like him, and, he was going to take, there was things like that happened in our past. And we started opening up the dialogue. I mean, we got it from from people in the government and outside the government elsewhere that came to us and said, hey, that's a guy you need to talk to. I mean, he is a guy who really, he is the most prominent member of that area. So it really gets back to talking to those folks. Honestly, our challenge was, that was politics as local, was getting Kabul to recognize that we needed their help with that, for them to recognize that and to pull them in. So I think that's the challenge. But certainly their interests lied with ours in that area because they didn't want any terrorists to happen as well, being up in their area. So.
Yes.
I want to follow up actually directly on that. A lot of what you've talked about, thank you, a lot of what you've talked about this morning has been about communicating with the locals, with influential leaders, and so on and so forth, which I think is something from a Kabul perspective or a Washington perspective. We spent a lot of time talking about the best way to do that. Your answer as it's emerged has been, well, the best way is retail. You get in the room with the guys, and that's how you get a message across. That's how you convey information. What I'm wondering about is the sustainability of that. That as we start pulling out, we're going to be talking more and more to Kabul, it seems to me, and there's going to be less opportunities like the ones you describe. Do you see a way for us to keep those kinds of lines of communications open with the Afghan people based on your experience, and if so, how?
Well, we went from 4, I think we call them rehabs or radios in a box, to 18 or 19 different radios. So, I mean, it's not just, certainly you're meeting primary folks that you think, there's nothing that can really take the place of, face-to-face sitting in a room with them. And it doesn't happen the first time. It happens the second or the third or the fourth time you meet them because you start to develop a relationship with folks, and more people come in. It's about mapping that all out. It's really about the consistency of your message, and that really all comes back to your actions. What are you doing? I mean, how are you acting? I think is that you can say whatever you want to say, and just like you can, I guess, getting back to the message that comes out from Kabul, it really comes down to what you're doing on the ground. Are you doing things to clean up corruption, for example? Are you doing things that speak to it? I don't know if that answers your question. It's going to be harder, obviously, if you got more presence. You're ubiquitous. You can get out with. Then obviously that's easier. It'd help to have companies everywhere, because they could, even though I would meet them, company commander could say, hey, I want the brigade commander to come down. I want you to bring the ABP general. So we could do that, and we could help facilitate some of that stuff that's there. Hopefully you're getting to a point where you start to see political accommodation happen, and you don't, they're doing that. And so then you don't need to. I mean, we need to be that party that helps them until they get.
The key is at some point you got to leverage your local partners.
Right.
So, I mean, whether it's your AVP or A&A commander or your district governor, you've got to know that person is roughly aligned, and that they're going to go have that conversation. They need to feel sufficiently empowered from Kabul. And I mean, there are challenges because they're balancing a lot in Kabul. I mean, you say, okay, well, where do the Pashtun fit in with the Northern Alliance, and who's got what equity in that local process? But if we were to reduce our footprint, then it would be our local partners that we'd have to we'd be relying on. And so again, part of the contact is with us to make sure our interests are aligned, and the other part is them.
This is going to be a serious problem, and in the job that you do, we're going to have to deal with this, because the micro solution is to work it out on the ground, because that's what provides the empirical conditions for the transition. But at the level of high politics, you are going to have to deal with people in Kabul. And there is going to be a dynamic where the more we work with people on the ground, in some ways, the more threatened folks in Kabul are going to be. And so how you manage, and this goes to your point, which is, because Kabul has sufficiently different interests from some of these individuals on the ground, reconciling these equities in practice is going to tax the creativity of, local commanders, local diplomats. And I think success in the transition will really depend on how adroit and how adaptable we are. But the larger question of how you deal with our principal ally, who is in the palace, I think is going to be a big issue. It's no longer finished. Yeah.
I think that what you just said is sort of premised on the notion that you can accumulate micro successes into a macro success. And I question the validity of that language.
No, that may well be true. That may well be true. I'm just making the point that even if we enjoy micro successes, we will not be able to rid ourselves of the macro-micro linkage, which is that our allies in Kabul have sufficiently different interests. And this will threaten those interests, and we'll have to find a way to make that work out. That point is taken. Yes, Chief.
Yes, so far we do not have micro successes, so it's maybe but not sure. And to go on this line, all your approach is based on two things. First, it's local. Second, it's about economics. And I don't think it's working. It cannot work, actually, because you're working in a place where it's not local. It's extremely transnational. People are moving all the time. Moving from Pakistan to Afghanistan, moving from Kabul to what's the currency in Jalalabad? It's the Kaldor. I mean, it's the Pakistani rupees. Okay? So you are not at all in a place where you can deal valley after valley. So the idea that you have a series of micro fields and you can stabilize, so-called stabilize, because I don't know what it means actually stabilizing. It's a very complex idea, and you can do that one tribe after another. Huh? That is not working, because you're dealing with people who have a larger view of Afghanistan. All the South it's Haqqani people. They are not dealing locally in Horiani, they are not dealing in Jagdalek or Sarobi, they are dealing with a strategic view. They are putting pressure on Kabul, and they are sending troops north of Kabul. So when you're dealing locally, the other guys are dealing nationally. So you're at a disadvantage here. And the second thing is your approach is mostly economics. And I don't think it's working. Why? Because people are not mostly interested in money. Of course, if you ask, do you want money? So, yes, okay. But they want justice. They want a state. Contrary to what people are saying, the Afghans are demanding a state. And who has a discourse about the state? It's precisely the Taliban. Or even the groups in Kunar, the different groups in Kunar. They have a discourse about the state, the Shariat. And by the way, all the Taliban propaganda is not in the name of the Taliban. It's the name of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So the Taliban are saying, okay, we are a state, we are giving you judges, and they are making progress. On the other hand, we are saying, okay, we are going to build you a bridge or a school or whatever. You have no political discourse. You are interpreting motivation mostly from an economic, as economical. And I think it's not working. It's about values. It's about jihad. It's about the state. It's about respect. When you're looking at the situation in Kunar, and you're speaking with people like the Majrou family that you should know probably, there's been terrible mistake made a few years ago in Kunar. People have been killed that should have been killed. And you have a deep resentment from the population here. So I think, the idea that you put more money, you deal better with your money, it's not going to make it.
Yeah, I'm just going to, it's very interesting comments. I appreciate it. Maybe we misspoke. We were actually talking about reducing the amount of money and increasing community involvement. I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about. We're not talking about putting more money. We're talking about de-accelerating. Okay, getting away from large-scale projects, getting away from contractors. The second thing we're talking about is, we are talking about justice, because one of the things that we were encouraging, and they actually started in Kunar, is public trials, so that people could see that the state also is Islamic and can actually administer justice that is recognizable to the people in line with a constitution. We're also, working on legal education so that people actually have a sense of, okay, there's an alternative vision to what the Taliban offer. I do take your point that in transnational, this is a war with many, many different equities coming in. At the same time, we're not entirely local. We were in contact with the Pakistan military. You have a whole international effort there. So there's a lot of other people that have a stake in the success. And again, talking about the Momand and other people that are moving back and forth. Yes, you're right. I wouldn't discount the strength of local politics and local identity. People did see themselves as Afghans. They certainly had a very strong tribal, but you yourself said that they want a state. So, it's an interesting proposition that nothing is working and there's no accumulation of success, and yet you're actually putting forward that people want a state. Well, that's what we also heard. We heard that people did want a state, and what they were not saying is we want a Taliban state. What they were saying is we need to figure out how this state can work better for us. And so, a lot of the effort that we were making was in order to enable those conditions to happen. It's also interesting, this gentleman mentioned the accumulation. I mean, we did see it as, and again, this becomes a theoretical debate, but we saw it as, in a sort of a tipping point paradigm where there are a number of things that are going on, and that's how people make choices. And you don't know where the tipping point is going to be, but you're certainly working toward that. So anyway, appreciate the comments, but
I'm going to disagree with you a little on that one point of the micro successes and whether or not to judge what's happening, but there's not some big grand thing I think that's all of a sudden going to happen over there that they're going to come to terms on it. They're going to. It's the Mullah Sadek example where they can let somebody come into the government that maybe is not part of their right now their alliance, and they're going to let them come in, and they're going to try that in bits and pieces. And I think that's how that's going to happen. Of course, I get paid when we're over there to make it work, whatever the policy is, and figure out how to make it work. And now I'm in a different place where I sit back here and look at it and study it a little bit different. But from actually getting paid to say, hey, that's what our country wants to do over there, and this is how we're going to figure it out, I think it's micro successes that do start to add up. A lot of times we said the same thing I think that you just repeated. We made mistakes. We killed people that we shouldn't have. But recognizing that, being transparent about it, going back and talking to those people and finding out what happened, what is it that we need to do to pull them back into government, not spending as much money as we've been spending. It is local governance. And when they start to see some of these things that start to change, if their big complaint over there is corruption, you have to change that from the local level too. I mean, they can't put out a decree from Kabul and say corruption's gone and now everything's going to get fixed. It's got to start happening at places, and it's how how we implement things, how we look at things with the local government that are going to make it happen. So I fully believe that. It was the same thing when I was in Iraq. And everybody said a lot of the same things, and it takes successes to add up over time. And we certainly realized that when we were talking with the HIG, that was and we were in contact with Kabul, that was much larger and went across our area. And that's just about being cohesive with all the U.S. government agencies as far as understanding the problem, so you can fit the whole thing together.
I'll be happy to take one more intervention before maybe two. Catherine and then the gentleman there.
Congratulations on your presentation. Thanks very much. I have a question in terms of Pakistan. We haven't talked too much about Pakistan. You're just mentioning Pakistan right there. And all the problems that you guys discussed, corruption, infusion of too much money, governance. I agree with you that there's too much money going in there, and scaling back is going to help the problem quite a bit, although we have a time deficit now with 7 months to go. Really, maybe looking out to 2015, that's still not a lot of time. But in terms of Pakistan, you almost have in Afghanistan, there could be an analogy of a bucket of water, and you have these porous borders. And I do believe there are a lot of micro successes in Afghanistan, but every time there is a success, the borders in Pakistan can cause major, major problems. So my question to you guys is, you looked at all of these problems. How did you how did that factor in the borders, Pakistan? And how did you communicate that back to Kabul and Washington? Was it just an intractable problem that you guys just said, oh, there's nothing we can do about it? Or did you have recommendations on how to address that problem at a local level? Not big policy, but small policy in the East. What did you guys do about it?
Yeah, there are two separate ways to address it. First of all is, we did complementary operations with the PAC mill, and that was by virtue of bringing them over, and we would go over there and we'd meet with them at the colonel's level and sometimes at the general officer level on a regular basis to try to get a common operating picture about what they would perceive as a threat and we would perceive as a threat. You often hear on the Afghan side, oh, it's the Pakistani intelligence that's doing everything. I honestly think that that's, in many cases, a sort of a general term that's thrown around for anybody who's moving across the border because they usually coming from Pakistan, but it doesn't necessarily mean, it's Pakistan directed. So, that was, on the military side, we had successful complementing operations where we were able to build a common operating picture. On the political side, it really comes down to economic transactions. Again, the volume of people now coming through Torkham Gate is 20,000 a day. We were looking at creating roads and border checkpoints up into Kunar that would allow alternative avenues for economic trade and transactions. So again, when Torkham gets shut down, it's a problem on both the Pakistan and the Afghan side. So there's a stake, and it's a tribal stake. Tribal folks are, heavily involved in the management of the border areas. A lot of people had equities in making actually the economics work. So, the interesting thing is, the gentleman mentioned Highway 1 that goes all the way through, not safe now. But I will tell you that, Torkham had very, very few incidents. We could surmise that, weapons and other things are moving through there, but everybody had a stake in its success. And so in that case, you had a proliferation of economic transactions. I mean, there's an entire city down there at Torkham Gate that's, auto repair, everything that you could want, a huge market there. And so that's where you're sort of building ties that give you the best opportunity to say, okay, this is, you both have a stake in relative peace here. So,
Catherine, you have the last word.
Goodness, even I should be able to manage that. My name is Catherine Dale from the Congressional Research Service. Randy and Dante, first of all, it is lovely to see you here. Thank you both so much for your incredible service, your leadership on the ground, and then also for coming to Washington and making all of us smarter with a perspective that we all too rarely hear here. Very briefly, both of you have emphasized the critical importance of the Afghan people, both in the work that you did on the ground and in the solutions looking ahead to ensure really Afghanistan's foundation of stability, to make sure that that's durable. A key part of that is the role of the Afghan people in holding their own leadership accountable, something we talked a lot about from the ISAF Joint Command. What exactly can the Afghan people do to help hold their leaders accountable? And importantly, what role can we play in helping them do it? Thank you.
I'll give one specific example, Catherine. I think that the people are willing to hold them accountable. I think what they want to see is when they do, that action's taken to actually, if they identify or highlight somebody who shouldn't be in a certain position, are people going to take action to actually remove them, investigate them if necessary, go through whatever their potential rule of law. It was a challenge for us in Manigai District, for example. It's up in the Pesh. This was after doing some of the budget. They find out that, okay, well, our guy's that's how he has his big house. We don't like that. And all the tribal elders got together and they signed a declaration. That's something that they very rarely do. And we showed that to some Afghan folks that had come down from Kabul. I think some deputy tribal affairs. He's like, oh my goodness, that never happens. The real challenge for them was did he actually get removed? So he initially did, and I don't know where we stand, but as the time we left, he hadn't, and that's where I think that they get discouraged they're willing to stand up for these things and to do them. There's got to be the right procedure to make sure that they're following through. And when to me, that's justice, and to them, I think that's justice. It's not necessarily rule of law; it's just justice. And if it's not happening, they lose a little hope.
Yeah, and just to follow through, diplomatically, the things that we can do is, work with Kabul. At the time, it was the Independent Directorate of Local Governance, which really had the biggest stake in the appointment of governors. And, it's having those discussions to say, okay, things that are taking place in the field, a governor wants to make a change at the district governor level because he's being responsive to the people. We want you to support him in doing that. It's no cost to us. It's a conversation that says, hey, we know what's happening out at the districts. We support you in what you're doing. This is a reform effort. We understand you've got a lot of different equities, but you're trying to get the people on your side. You're trying to have show that the governance is responsible. And here's a clear-cut case. And then we play that facilitative role to make sure that people feel sufficiently empowered to do that, because otherwise they can drop out. So.
I'm going to extend this by just one more intervention because we actually have an Afghan voice in the room, which is extremely rare. And it's always strange in Washington to be talking so much about Afghanistan and never hearing from the Afghans. So please,
Thank you, Ashley. Sorry for being late. The man on 1600 needs to do something about the traffic. Congratulations. It's a great approach, and I think the Afghans would appreciate it. Despite what Gilles said, the concerns that are, especially in the Pashtun areas, and just for the fact that you're doing this in Kunar, people think that Kandahar is dangerous. They haven't heard about Kunar, Logar, or Jalalabad yet, and I hope that we don't hear much about it in the future. But and the way you're communicating, I think is great with the people, because from what I see, the Afghans have right now in 2010, in comparison with 2001, have no idea what you're doing there. So there's clearly no message, and they're disillusioned. And I think that the mission has really changed. Washington is talking about this Al-Qaeda and what we're doing to disrupt them. But it's becoming a different mission. So that needs to be addressed maybe sometimes by you, Gilles, or by the Carnegie Endowment, that the mission has changed. It has developed into something totally different. It is not the same. Yet, I just wanted to give you my support. Congratulations on what you're doing. Thank you.
Well, on that note, I want to call the meeting formally to an end. And we are not going to obviously resolve the big policy debates about Afghanistan today or any time in the future. But the nation is involved in an extremely difficult and complex endeavor. And I think what you see at the table today is an experiment in bringing together both the civilian and the military to do something that we are usually not very good at. And so I want to end by actually thanking both Dante and Randy for their service to the country and for, working under circumstances of substantial adversity. And to thank all of you for coming this morning, despite all the adversity that surrounds us in the weather. And hopefully we will see all of you again. I look forward to welcoming you back in the Carnegie Endowment. Thank you very much. Thank you.